Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something really important, California's groundwater.
Yeah.
We've all heard about the mega drought out west, but we're going to be going beyond the headlines today.
Absolutely.
And really trying to understand how this is impacting groundwater, especially for agriculture, which, as we know, is
Huge.
a huge part of California's economy and its identity.
Yeah.
So our main source for this deep dive is an article titled California Groundwater Pricing,
Yeah.
which translates to California groundwater pricing. So that gives you a little hint of where we're going with this.
Yeah,
But
sure.
to kick things off, I think it's important to kind of set the stage here. How bad is this mega drought, really? I mean, the source mentions that
Pretty bad.
it's the driest 2 decades in over 1,000 years in the western U.S.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. I mean, these numbers are just mind-boggling. And climate change is, of course, playing a huge role here.
Right.
Higher temperatures mean more evaporation and less precipitation. Less rain and snow. All of that is further depleting our water sources.
Makes sense.
And here's something that really struck me when I was reading this article. In some areas of California, the ground is actually sinking because of how much groundwater we've pumped out.
Whoa, wait. I mean literally sinking.
Literally sinking. It's like,
Okay.
imagine a giant sponge and you keep squeezing it and squeezing it. Eventually, it starts to collapse in on itself.
So we're not just talking about, like, wells drying up. We're
Yeah.
talking about the land itself changing.
Yeah, the topography is being altered
Wow.
because of this.
That really paints a picture of how
It's dire.
dire the situation is. And, of course, agriculture is, like you said, a huge part of this equation.
Yeah.
California relies so heavily on groundwater for its crops,
Especially during a drought.
especially during a drought that dependence just skyrockets.
Yeah, think about it. In a normal year, about a third of California's water comes from underground aquifers. But during a drought, that number jumps way up. And for a long time, there were basically no limits on how much farmers could pump. It was essentially a free-for-all.
Right, because if it's there, you use it.
Yeah, you got to keep those crops growing. But as you can imagine, that's not really a sustainable approach.
No, not at all. Especially when you consider these long-term impacts, like the land sinking and,
Yeah,
just the depletion of these aquifers.
absolutely.
So thankfully, things started to change in 2014 with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Right.
And that sounds like a step in the right direction. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it was a huge step forward.
Yeah.
Basically, this act said, okay, enough with the free-for-all. We need to start managing this precious resource sustainably.
Okay.
So it mandates that local agencies figure out how to balance how much groundwater is pumped with how much can naturally replenish over the next 2 decades.
So it's not just about stopping all pumping. It's about finding that
That balance, right?
that balance.
That equilibrium.
And this isn't just some small pilot program. This is
Well,
like a
this is a big deal.
statewide.
It covers over 95% of agricultural groundwater use in California.
Wow.
Huge implications.
So by January 2022, all these local agencies had to submit their plans to the state, outlining how they're going to achieve this sustainable groundwater management.
Exactly, their roadmap for the future.
So over 100 plans are on the table right now.
Yeah, a lot to sift through.
A lot to sift through. What are some of the key approaches that they're using? I mean, simply telling everyone to use less water is probably not going to cut it.
No, you're right. It's much more nuanced than that. Some agencies are looking at programs that pay farmers to leave some of their land fallows.
Okay, so basically saying, hey, if you don't grow anything this season, you'll save water and we'll compensate you for that lost income.
Exactly. It's a pretty straightforward way to reduce water use, and it might be an easier sell politically compared to some other policies.
Right, because you're not necessarily telling people what to do.
Yeah.
You're giving them an option.
Exactly. You're providing incentives.
But wouldn't that just be a temporary fix?
That's a good point. You're right, in a way. It's more like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
It doesn't really change how we value and manage groundwater in the long term.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of pricing comes in. And this is where our source article gets really interesting.
Okay, so instead of a free-for-all, the idea is to make groundwater use more like paying for electricity. You use more, you pay more.
Exactly. You're attaching a value to it.
Okay, so we're talking about actually putting a price tag on groundwater. But how do you even begin to price something as essential and often unpredictable as groundwater?
Well, there are a few different mechanisms being proposed. Some areas are considering a straight-up tax on the amount of water pumped.
Yeah.
Others are looking at creating a system of tradable water rights where farmers can buy and sell their allotted amount.
Oh, that's interesting. So kind of like a cap and trade system.
Exactly. You're creating a market for water.
So it sounds like setting the price itself is pretty critical.
Oh, absolutely.
What are some of the challenges in getting that right?
Well, one challenge is simply the lack of existing infrastructure, like groundwater meters on farms.
Right.
If you can't accurately measure how much water each person is using, it's hard to charge them fairly.
You can't have a water bill without knowing how much water you've used.
Right, exactly. And then beyond the logistics, there's also potential for pushback from farmers. I mean, no one likes to see their costs go up.
Especially when their livelihoods are on the line.
Exactly. So there's definitely going to be some political challenges there. But here's a glimmer of hope. The article says that over 60% of the plans submitted actually include some form of pricing mechanism.
Okay, so that's more than I would have expected. It seems like there's a growing recognition that this might be the most effective path forward.
Yeah, it seems like the tide might be turning. But the big question is, are these pricing plans actually going to work?
Right. Will they actually change behavior and lead to more sustainable water use?
That's the million-dollar question. And the article raises some concerns that the proposed prices might be too low to actually make a real difference.
Huh. So it's not just about having a price, it's about having the right price. How do they determine what that right price is?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. The article highlights that some plans might be basing their pricing on the wrong things. For example, some are tying the price to the acreage a farmer owns rather than the amount of water they actually use.
So you could have a farmer with a small plot of land using tons of water and paying the same as a farmer with a large property who's being super water efficient.
Exactly. It doesn't really incentivize conservation, does it?
No, not at all. It's like charging for electricity based on the size of your house instead of how much power you actually use.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense.
So even with these pricing mechanisms in place, there's a lot of fine-tuning needed to make sure they're actually effective.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll definitely be digging into more as we continue our deep dive.
This all sounds pretty complex, but it's clear that California is taking some big steps to address this groundwater crisis. So where do we go from here? What else do we need to consider?
Well, one crucial aspect that the article highlights is the balance between focusing on increasing water supply versus decreasing demand.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this supply versus demand dilemma.
So many of the submitted plans are really focused on finding ways to get more water into the system. You know, things like capturing flood flows during the rainy season and using that to replenish aquifers, or buying surface water from other users.
Okay, on the surface, that makes sense. I mean, more water is a good thing, right? What's wrong with focusing on increasing supply?
Well, the problem is that it might create a false sense of security and lead to delays in implementing those demand management measures.
So it's like saying we don't need to worry about using less because we'll just find more. But what happens when those new sources are more limited or unreliable than expected?
Exactly. That's when competition for those limited resources intensifies, and you might even see conflicts arise between different agencies all vying for the same water.
So focusing too much on supply might actually be delaying the inevitable, the need to seriously reduce our water demand.
Exactly.
It's a tough reality to face, but it's something we need to talk about.
But before we get into those solutions, I think we need to take a closer look at the potential impact all of this will have on farmers.
You're right. Pricing groundwater, even if done correctly, is going to have real economic consequences, especially for farmers who are currently heavy water users. And that's something we'll explore in our next segment.
Okay.
And, as we delve deeper into this economic side of things, it's crucial to remember that all of this ultimately boils down to what we as consumers demand.
Oh, that's a really good point. Sometimes it's easy to forget that our everyday choices, what we buy, what we eat, all of that plays a huge role in this whole complex issue.
Exactly.
And
Think about it. What you choose to eat, what you wear, the products you buy it all, has an impact on how much water is used to produce those things. We were talking earlier about almonds.
Right. And I remember reading all these headlines a few years ago about almond milk and,
Oh, yeah.
the environmental impact and how...
Almond shaming? Yeah. Almond shaming, exactly. But you mentioned that it's not as simple as just like singling out specific crops.
Right.
It's about understanding the bigger picture of water use across the board.
Exactly. And I think that's really important to emphasize. While almonds are a major crop in California, when you look at the overall water consumption, focusing on just one crop can be really misleading. So it's about looking at overall water use in agriculture, not just individual crops.
Okay, that makes sense. So how can we as consumers become more informed about the water footprint of our choices? I mean, it feels a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It can be, but there are resources out there to help you understand the impact of your choices. Like there are websites and apps that track the virtual water content of different products. Have you ever heard of that term, virtual water?
Virtual water, not really. What does that mean exactly?
So think of it this way. Your t-shirt doesn't just magically appear in the store, right?
Right. A lot of steps.
A lot of water went into growing that cotton, dyeing a fabric, shipping it to you. That's all part of its virtual water footprint. So it's basically the total amount of water used to produce something, taking into account everything from growing the raw materials to packaging the final product.
Wow, that's a really eye-opening way to think about it. It's like there's this hidden water cost embedded in everything we buy.
Absolutely.
So knowing this, what can we actually do as consumers to support more sustainable water practices, both in California and beyond?
Well, a good starting point is being more mindful of your food choices, for example. Opting for more plant-based meals can significantly reduce your water footprint compared to a meat-heavy diet.
Yeah, I've heard that livestock production, especially beef, requires a lot of water.
It does, and it's not just about the water the animals drink, it's also the water needed to grow their feed. So yeah, being more plant-forward is a big one.
Okay, that makes sense. What else can we do?
Reducing food waste is another huge factor. I mean,
Oh.
all that water used to produce food that ends up in the trash is just a massive waste.
Oh, absolutely. I'm definitely guilty of throwing out wilted veggies more often than I'd like to admit.
We've all been there, but even small changes like planning your meals, storing your food properly, and getting creative with leftovers can make a difference.
So it's about making conscious choices throughout that whole food cycle, from production to consumption. What about the products we buy beyond food? Does that factor in as well?
Of course, take the clothing industry, for instance. It's a major water consumer. Choosing clothes made from sustainable materials like organic cotton or recycled fibers and supporting brands that prioritize water conservation in their production can make a difference.
So it's about looking beyond just the price tag and considering the environmental impact of what we buy. But as much as individual choices are important, I can't help but wonder, can consumer awareness alone really solve this problem? Don't we need larger-scale solutions like government policies and regulations?
You're absolutely right. Individual actions are crucial, but strong policies and regulations are equally important to guide water management on a bigger scale. Remember, the article we're discussing focuses on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's a step in the right direction.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. We need both individual responsibility and effective governance to really tackle this challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
What specific policy recommendations does the article make in terms of pricing and other regulations?
Well, the article really emphasizes the need for groundwater pricing that's high enough to actually influence behavior change. Remember that research we talked about earlier from the Coachella Valley showing that if the price isn't set at a level that makes farmers actually reconsider their water usage, it's not going to be effective at curbing overpumping.
So it's not just about having any price, it's about setting the right price. And it seems like it could be tricky to figure out.
It does. It requires careful analysis and, a willingness to adapt and make changes based on real-world data. But it's not just about the number on the price tag. The article also points out that, the pricing should be tied to the actual amount of water used, not things like acreage.
Right. So you're incentivizing actual water conservation, not just penalizing farmers who might already be using water efficiently. Are there any other key policy recommendations?
Yeah, the article also highlights the importance of addressing equity concerns. For instance, they propose using progressive tax structures, so small-scale farmers who typically use less water aren't disproportionately impacted.
That makes sense. It's about finding solutions that are both environmentally sound and socially just.
Exactly. And they also suggest using the revenue generated from groundwater pricing to support new regional jobs. So you're not just imposing costs, but also helping communities adapt to a more sustainable future.
Well, that's a really interesting idea. So there's this potential to promote water conservation while also investing in economic development.
Yeah.
But are we seeing any of these policy recommendations actually being put into action?
Well, the fact that over 60% of those submitted plans include some form of pricing mechanism is encouraging. It suggests that there's a growing understanding of its importance in managing groundwater sustainably.
That is good news. But I recall the article also raised some concerns about those prices potentially being too low and not always being tied to the right metrics.
Yeah, that's right. That's why ongoing monitoring and evaluation are so important. It's not enough to just implement policies. You need to track their effectiveness and make adjustments along the way.
So it's an iterative process, constantly learning and adapting to find the best solutions.
Exactly. And that's where research and data analysis play such a crucial role. By carefully studying the impacts of different policies, we can gather the evidence we need to inform future decision making.
It sounds like California is at a pivotal moment in its journey towards sustainable water management.
It really is. The choices made in the coming years will have long-lasting effects on the state's environment, its economy, its future.
We've covered a lot of ground so far in this deep dive. We've explored the intricacies of California's water crisis, the challenges and potential of pricing groundwater, and the significance of both individual and collective action.
And, we've seen that even seemingly small choices, like what we eat or the clothes we dye, can contribute to a more water-secure future.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the focus on supply-side solutions in some of the groundwater management plans.
Ah, yes. That tendency to prioritize finding more water instead of using less, it's a crucial point to consider.
Yeah, it seems like we're just delaying the inevitable instead of tackling that root problem of overconsumption. But what are the potential long-term consequences of that kind of approach?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore in our final segment.
All right, so we're back, and you kind of left us hanging there with this question about the potential downsides of focusing too much on finding new water sources instead of, using less.
Right, because it's very tempting to just think, oh, if we're running low on water, let's just go find more. But as we've been discussing, that kind of approach can be pretty short-sighted.
Yeah, it feels like we're just delaying the inevitable instead of actually tackling the root problem of overconsumption. But what does that actually look like in the real world? What are the potential consequences of this kind of supply-side thinking?
Well, one major concern is that it creates this false sense of security. If agencies are banking on securing more water from somewhere, they might not feel as much urgency to implement those demand management strategies like water conservation or pricing.
So it's like thinking, oh, we don't need to worry about using less water because we've got this new source coming online. But what happens when that new source isn't as reliable or as plentiful as they hoped?
Exactly, and that's where things can get a little messy. We're already seeing this play out in some areas where competition for water is really heating up. If you have multiple agencies that are all relying on the same limited sources, like trying to capture those winter flood flows, it can lead to conflict and even legal battles.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for a water war, especially in a state like California with so many different, needs and interests all vying for those same resources.
Right. And then there's the environmental impact to consider as well. Building new infrastructure to capture and transport that water can have pretty significant consequences, potentially harming sensitive ecosystems and habitats.
So it's not just about the economics of water. It's also about, the environmental trade-offs. But are there alternatives to this supply-focused approach? Is there a way to kind of shift the mindset towards, more sustainable demand management?
Absolutely. And that's where those pricing mechanisms we were talking about earlier can play a really critical role. When you put a price on groundwater, it sends a clear signal that this resource is valuable and it needs to be used wisely. It encourages people to conserve, find more efficient ways to use that water, and maybe even explore alternative approaches.
So it's about moving away from that more is always better mentality and embracing a more mindful approach to water use.
Right. It's about asking, how can we use the water we already have more effectively, rather than constantly searching for new sources?
And the article highlights that pricing allows for more flexibility and innovation as well, right? Like farmers can choose the water-saving strategies that work best for their specific situation instead of being forced into like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. It empowers them to be part of the solution. But I know you're probably thinking, does this pricing thing actually work in the real world? Are there any examples of this actually being successful?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Are there places that has figured this out?
There are, and the article actually mentions one right here in California, the Coachella Valley. They've had groundwater meters and pricing in place for a while now, and it's giving researchers some really valuable insights into how farmers respond to those economic signals.
Oh yeah, you mentioned earlier that their research showed that farmers weren't very responsive to like small price increases. So what does that tell us about setting the price? How do we make sure it's actually effective?
It shows that the price needs to be substantial enough to actually motivate some real change. If it's too low, farmers might not really have a strong enough incentive to adjust their practices.
Right. It's like those loyalty programs where you have to spend a ton of money to get like a tiny little reward. It's just not that motivating.
Exactly. You need a price that actually gets people's attention and makes them think twice about how much water they're using.
It sounds like finding that sweet spot, a price that encourages conservation but doesn't, create undue burden on farmers is a real challenge.
It definitely requires careful analysis and a willingness to, adapt and make changes based on what the data is telling you. But the Coachella Valley example shows that it can be done.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear about,
Yeah.
these success stories like that. It gives me hope that we can find solutions to this water crisis, even with the pressures of climate change and growing demand.
Yeah, hope is essential, but it's important to remember that there's no single magic bullet here. Addressing this issue is going to require a multi-pronged approach, that includes pricing, water conservation, education investments, and more efficient technologies, and even things like land use planning.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that water is this incredibly precious and interconnected resource that needs to be managed thoughtfully and collaboratively.
And that's a message that really extends far beyond California. As climate change continues to impact water availability worldwide, the lessons learned here in California could really serve as a model for other regions facing similar challenges.
Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with California's groundwater crisis, but we've ended up with this much broader perspective on the global importance of sustainable water management.
And that's what's so fascinating about these deep dives, isn't it? It allows us to kind of connect these seemingly disparate ideas and gain a deeper understanding of how interconnected our world really is.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, both in terms of my own personal water use, but also the role we all play in creating a more sustainable future.
And that's what we hope for with every deep dive, to spark your curiosity, encourage dialogue, and empower you to be more informed and engaged with these critical issues.
Absolutely well said. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you could design the perfect water management system for your own community, what would it look like? What values and principles would you prioritize?
That's a great question to consider, and I encourage all of you to check out the resources that we mentioned and keep learning about this fascinating world of water, because as we've seen in this deep dive, water isn't just a resource, it's the lifeblood of our planet.
Well said. And on that note, that's a wrap on our deep dive into California groundwater. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay hydrated.